Well, it looks like we're going to get started. Feel free to take a look at what's in the back. Hi, I'm Maeve Clark, and I'm Coordinator of Adult Services here at the Iowa City Public Library. Welcome to the library for our second WOW, Weber on Wednesday event. During the month of May, the library celebrates not only National Historic Preservation Month and local history, but also local historian Irving Weber. This is our annual Irving Weber lecture, so I'm going to share with you a little bit about Irving Weber. And if you were here for this afternoon's program, you heard this, but now you get to hear it again, and maybe at the last program I'll do a quiz and see how much retention we have of our Irving Weber biography. Irving B. Weber lived his entire life and almost the entire 20th century in his beloved Iowa City. His family roots were deep in the beginnings of Iowa City, as his maternal grandparents settled in the city in 1839. His paternal grandparents came to town in 1857. He was born in 1900, the very beginning of the 20th century. He was educated in Iowa City Public Schools and graduated from the University of Iowa in 1922. He's remembered for many things. He was the University of Iowa's first All-American swimmer. He was the founder of the Quality Check Dairies and served as its president until its retirement in 1966. He was an active member of the Iowa City Host Noon Lions Club. Patty McCarthy is here in the audience representing them. And he was the local school board president from 1952 to 53. In 1994, the Irving B. Weber Elementary School was named in his honor. Irving B. Weber may be most remembered for over the 800 articles he wrote for the Iowa City Press-Citizen beginning in 1973. And we have a copy of the 8 volumes that the Iowa City Noon Host Lions Club printed that contain a number of Irving B. Weber's articles that were in the Iowa City Press-Citizen. He told what it was like to grow up in Iowa City, the best places to buy penny candy. Imagine that, penny candy. The joys of cooling off in Melrose Lake in the summer and of sledding parties on closed-off streets. He recorded for future generations the story of Iowa City as no one else could. In 1989, in gratitude for his work in recording local history, Irving B. Weber was named as Iowa City's official historian. All of the articles Irving B. Weber wrote for the Iowa City Press-Citizen are available online at the University of Iowa's Digital Library through the cooperation of the Iowa City Public Library, the Iowa City Host Lions Club, and Lolly Eggers. In 2006, Lolly Parker Eggers, who was the library director before our current director, published Iowa City's Irving Weber, a biography, and I also have a copy of that next to the 8 volumes of the Irving B. Weber history stories. Her book chronicles Weber's life and provides information about 20th century Iowa City. Irving B. Weber died in 1997, barely missing a century of life. If we've piqued your interest in local history or exploring your family's history, please take a trip to the second floor of the library. We have many fascinating items on Iowa City and Johnson County, as well as materials on how to research your family's story. This evening's program is our annual Irving Weber History Lecture. Tonight's lecture is The History of Transportation in Iowa. Our speaker is Leighton Christensen, Iowa Department of Transportation librarian. Leighton is an Eastern Iowa native and lived at different times in Iowa City, Coralville, and Riverside. He attended Kirkwood Community College and the University of Iowa, graduating with an English major and a computer science minor. Leighton received his master's degree in library and information science from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I always get that wrong. Urbana-Champaign in May 2012.
They always get it wrong.
Maybe that's it. And has been the librarian at the Department of Transportation since July 2012. Leighton.
All right.
Oh, one last thing.
Go ahead.
So I have a flyer on our other Irving Weber Days celebrations, or what we're calling WOW, Weber on Wednesday, next to the books, and also a great big bookmark talking about history at icpl.org, Iowa City Public Library's digital history project.
Great. Well, thanks, Maeve. It is a pleasure and an honor to be here for the Weber Lecture and get to tell a little bit of the story of Iowa. The lecture tonight is A Journey to Transportation, and it's a history not only of the Iowa Department of Transportation and the Iowa Highway Commission that came before it, but of transportation in Iowa generally. And I want to coin a phrase tonight, if I can, and say that all history is local. And what I mean by that is history is local based on what entity is keeping that history, or who's keeping track of it. And so the history of transportation that I'll present tonight is at a very high level view. It's from the state, the Iowa State Highway Commission, the Iowa DOT. It's from our archives. So there are certain projects that we were, intensely involved in, and other things that we weren't. A lot of local stuff that we may have advised on, the engineers may have helped out with, but weren't projects completed or funded by the Highway Commission or the DOT. So I won't know those stories. Stories of how the transportation infrastructure that develops in Iowa, starting in the 1800s up to today, impacts individual lives. The much more interesting aspect of history, in my opinion, I also don't have. I depend on you then to include that in the discussion. And if you'd like to share that with us, I'd be happy to have it. And if there are particularly interesting stories about transportation in your lives that you'd like to share with us at the Iowa Department of Transportation Library, I'd be happy to collect those too and include those on our virtual museum or on our history website that I'll show you here in a bit. At the Iowa Department of Transportation, we began celebrating the 100 years of the Department of Transportation last April 2013. We've sort of brought that official celebration to an end here in 2014, but I still have bookings for this lecture, so I'm still on the road. And while it's me here at the front of the room, it's not my own work. It's not entirely my own work. I had the pleasure of co-authoring this lecture with Andy Lunan from District 1, but I worked for many months. In fact, some of the very first things I did on the job in July 2012 was start to attend 100th anniversary planning committee meetings with all these great folks that you see here from not only in the headquarters at Ames, but from around our district offices, from around the state. And they all contributed in one way or another to what I'm going to present to you tonight. One of the key outputs of the 100th Anniversary Committee is our Iowa Department of Transportation History Timeline that you can find on our website. And when you leave the lecture tonight, if you pick up the bibliography that's on the back table in the room, there's links to many of the things that I'll talk about tonight, including this timeline. It's interactive. It slides backward and forward in time. You can click on a story or a picture. It pops up. There might be more text. There might be more pictures hidden in there. There's a couple of movies hidden in that, including This Is Your Highway Commission from 1968, when the interstates are still pristine and new, and the fins are big on the cars, and there's just not as much growth and things along the interstate. It's all very new, and it's fun to watch, and it's got that marvelous narrative voice that we all remember from high school film strips. So please do check that out. As we go forward tonight, I will pick on a few of the highlights from the history timeline, but it's a growing thing. It's one of those things that we will continue to add to as the years go on. It wasn't just a one-year project, because as any state agency, we start to have generational turnover. New people come in, older people leave and retire, luckily. And there are things left around the complex that you don't know about, stories, artifacts, records that as those of us who are newer to the institution come in, we're like, what's the story behind that? And unless we capture that from people before they leave the building, we may lose that. So part of this experience has been, for those of us who have been at the DOT less long, is capturing some of that knowledge and preserving it for the folks who come after. One of the other ways that we're doing that is with the new Iowa Department of Transportation Virtual Museum. One of the things, I mentioned artifacts. If you go around the building, every office has its own little display case, whether it's the bridge office or the geology folks with their fossils, or the awards trophy case for culvert design and highway design, which may not sound sexy to you and me, but for engineers, these are important things. And what we are doing with the virtual museum is capturing the stories between the art, behind the art artifacts and archives at the Department of Transportation. One of the first things we started with is possibly the most maligned piece of public art in Ames, which is Woman's Head. And there's the full story there about how Woman's Head went from an idea in 1976 to a sculpture made of wood and redwood to a sculpture made of steel in 1999 and where it stands today. It's been moved around. And we give an interesting aspect of the story. So please do check that out as well. So let's hit some of the highlights from the timeline as we move forward. Now, when most people think about the Department of Transportation or transportation in the state of Iowa, they think about the modes of transportation, how you get from one place to another. So whether that's by air, by highway, by rail, or now more and more by bike trail, multi-use trail. If you use public transit, in all of our counties have public transit in Iowa of one type or another. And most of us have driver's licenses and cars that we register. Now, I can say for a fact, without knowing anybody in the room, and I realize this isn't a good sampling, but I'm going to take a wild stab at this one, that I know that most of you are most familiar with our highways and roads in Iowa and our folks at the DMV. Now, how can I make that claim? Of the 3 million of us who live in the state of Iowa, more than 2 million of us have driver's licenses, and between us, we have 4 million registered vehicles. So you all have, somebody has my extra vehicle. I only have one. So if you want to give me the keys after the lecture, I'll be happy to take it with me. But, I mean, that's the story of the 20th century, is highways and roads and automobiles. And so that's how most of us relate to transportation in Iowa. One of the things that Maeve didn't put in the bio, because I didn't mention it, is I used to be an over-the-road truck driver. I've got 1.5 million miles. I have a seat in my pants knowledge of transportation history, as I like to say. So I have a slightly different story to tell. Maybe somebody in here used to work on the railroad or had a family member work on the railroad. And there's those sorts of stories that are also interesting to tell. The story of the rise and decline and the re-engineering of the railroad in the state of Iowa over the 20th century and into the 21st. So, you know, it's safe to say that given the broad different ways that people access transportation in the state of Iowa and all the different projects and that the Iowa DOT funds, carries out, the standards we set, the rules for construction that we set, that we touch every aspect of life, leisure, and commerce in one way or another. And as you know, nationally, transportation is 10% of U.S. gross domestic product. You might think you order it on the internet, but that box still comes in a truck after somebody packed it at a warehouse. So there's still a lot of transportation going on even in the digital age. And you know, something that we should be aware of going forward. And it's that story that I'm going to start to tell just a little bit tonight. Maeve asked earlier, has the Department of Transportation or its predecessor, the Iowa State Highway Commission, always been in Ames, or did it start in Des Moines? It's always been in Ames. Why? Because the engineers have always been in Ames at Iowa State College before it became Iowa State University. That's where the engineers were at. So it made sense in 1904 to the Iowa legislators to set up an advisory body at Iowa State College based in the engineering department to help the cities and the counties and the municipalities start to build better roads and better bridges because the automobile was coming and we needed to be, and let's not forget, mechanized agriculture. The tractor was coming. Those two things, cars and tractors, we're going to talk, they figure a lot into what we're going to talk about tonight. The world was changing. How we got from one place to another, how we grew our crops was changing. And that advisory body started in 1904 to help set new standards and talk to the engineers at the county level about how we build better roads and bridges that are going to last longer. Because, you know, any good rainstorm could wash out a road or a bridge at that point in Iowa. And after a few years, the legislatures realized that that wasn't going to be enough. An advisory body wasn't enough. We need a government body that can set legal standards for construction in the state so that bridges are going to be safe when you cross them, so that roads are built to a certain standard. So in 1913, the Iowa State Highway Commission became a state government body on its own with its own budget and its ability to set rules and laws. It was still housed at the engineering building at Iowa State College until 1924 when we moved into this building in Ames. This building is located at the corner of Lincoln Way and Grand Avenue. There used to be a set of Chicago Northwestern Railroad tracks running right along the eastern side of the property, which is now the extension of Grand Avenue. That building was built for $123,000 on 5 acres of ground donated to the state by the citizens of Ames. They passed a hat. They took out subscriptions, basically in order to make sure that the Highway Commission stayed in Ames for two reasons. The first one's pretty obvious. There's a lot of jobs in having a government body in your city, and so it's worth being there, worth having them in your city. And the other thought was, well, if we put the Highway Commission in Ames, away from Des Moines, we can help keep politics out of transportation. Some dreams die an ugly death. This was one of them. But nonetheless, we've been there now at the same address now for 90 years. That building is still a part of our complex. We've grown and added on and morphed around it, but as of course the needs and the transportation in Iowa has changed and grown and morphed over that same 100 years. So let's look at a few of those highlights. The first commissioner of the Iowa State Highway Commission was Anson Marston. He was the dean of engineering at Iowa State College when the Iowa State Highway Commission was brought into being. And Marston, started on the Highway Commission as far back as 1904. And Marston and Thomas McDonald and others who went on to become very important in transportation engineering, not only in Iowa but also nationally, in the early days, in 1904, would go out and do road schools. So they would get on the train, because in 1904, that was the best way to get around the state. You would get on the train, and you would ride to the county seat, and then you might get on a horse and ride to where you were doing the demonstration for that day on road building and bridge building. So they had some exciting times getting around in the state, but it was bringing that engineering, that scientific approach to transportation infrastructure in Iowa in the early 1900s that was so important. And then Thomas White, one of Anson Marston's students, whoops, I blanked, sorry. We'll move on. So, why did we need a highway commission in 1913? Because of the mud. Iowa got its first official road in 1838, and Iowa City was its terminus. It ran from Keokuk up to Iowa City, and then was extended from Iowa City up to Dubuque, what we know as Dillon's Furrow, if you know that part of your history, later on in 1939. And it was a dirt road. I mean, it was basically the driest ground between here and Keokuk, so it was up on the ridges, and it probably already existed in a lot of places because animals had already picked it out because it was out of the marshes and whatnot, or natives had picked out the drier path between different locales, and so that was pretty much the road that was picked, and it was dirt. And by the time that this Model T gets stuck in the mud on US 30, Lincoln Highway, between Nevada and Ames, Iowa has 104,000 miles of road. All but 12 miles of it is dirt. So, on a rainy day, Iowans used to say, the roads are just as deep as they are wide. And so this, he's buried up to his axle because there's no drainage, there's no gravel, and if we're going to take advantage of the car and of the tractor, we're going to need better roads. We can't have this sort of bogged down every time there's rain. We can't have the incident like we did in 1922 after the football game here at the University of Iowa, where people are heading back up to Cedar Rapids and are completely bogged down and jump back on the interurban to come back to town or to ride to Cedar Rapids and spend the night. Farmers making $50 a pull to pull your car out of the mud with their team and wagon. So, a good deal for them. So this is why the Highway Commission had to come into being. And they set about getting Iowa out of the mud just as quickly as they could. Now, this little chart makes a liar out of me. I said just a minute ago there was 104,000 miles of road. That's every road in the state. By law, the Highway Commission was only responsible for the primary roads. Those are the roads that connected Des Moines, the state capital, with every county seat, the area of local government, and every town of population of 1,000 or more. Those are the primary roads. Those are the ones that are going to have the most traffic, the most people live on them. We're going to have the most necessary to connect up the various government entities. Those are going to be the roads the Highway Commission is responsible for. You can see over the 20s that it's a moving target, starting at 6,600 and ending up at 7,200 because towns grow. More cities have a population of 1,000 or more, so we have to connect up more and more of those towns to the network. You can see that over that period, we pave more than 3,000 miles of road. In 1920, there were 67 miles of paved roads. So there'd been a little bit of paving between 1918 and 1920. We went from 12 to 67, and then things sort of take off over the next decade. And many, many miles of road, another nearly 3,000 are graveled, and so you still have, at the beginning of the Depression era, 1,000 miles of road in Iowa, primary road connecting up major population centers, that's still dirt. And what's amazing is even during the Depression, the state continues to erase those miles of dirt roads. So by 1934, we can officially say Iowa's out in the mud. One of the ways that you can measure the progress, if you go take a look at the historical Iowa maps that there's a link for on the bibliography, you look at the maps from the year 1932 and 1933. Because as you may have heard, the state's only going to print a map every 1 or 2 years. Like the 2013 map that's in the back of the room, we're not going to print a fresh map until 2015. Because the system doesn't change a whole lot from year to year anymore, right? Most of the roads are already built. Aside from adding a nice extra lane out here on 80 so you can get through Coralville a little more safely, we don't add a lot of infrastructure from year to year. 1932, the state of Iowa had to print a new map every month from May until December because they were paving so much road. So much progress was being made, even at the height of the Depression, in order to get rid of our dirt roads, that new maps were printed every month. And you can go take a look at those on the Historical Archive. Here's the other reason we needed a highway commission: bridges. The bridge you see here was, it's 8 planks, 6 nails, and a whole lot of prayers. It's not necessarily, and probably built in the late 1800s, early 1900s, with no idea that this giant steam engine was going to drive across it in 1914. That it wasn't built for that sort of weight. It was built for animal and human power, because for the 12,000 years before this bridge collapsed in Iowa, people got around on their own feet or water power or animal power, and nothing this heavy. Embarrassingly, for those of us at the DOT, the young man standing next to the traction engine here that's collapsed that bridge is the Chickasaw County road engineer. He was probably moving from one job to another, taking a bridge he's probably taken a dozen times before with that same engine, and this time it happened to collapse. This wasn't always a happy incident. Many, many people lost their lives on bridges in Iowa during this time, during collapses such as this, including contract threshers, harvesters who would come through town with their traction engines and whatnot and collapse bridges. And so the Highway Commission had 2 goals: make Iowa's bridges safer and get Iowa out of the dirt and into solid roads. Now, Iowa City, because it's built at about the last navigable place on the Iowa River, right? Because you could get a steamboat. In the 1800s, you could get a steamboat up about this far. I mean, there are days when we look at it out there and we're like, you can't. And there are other days, like in 2008, maybe, that you could have gotten a whole fleet of ships all over town. I was here. I was sandbagging up at the water plant that summer. But it's hard to think of Iowa as a steamboat stop, Iowa City as a steamboat stop. But part of the reason it's here is because of that. And therefore, there are, by my rough count, 14 bridges for pedestrians, cars, and trains in Iowa City, Coralville city limits. And that's a rough estimate. And that's only talking about the ones that cross the river. That's not talking about the ravines and the creeks and the railroad tracks over on the east side of town. This bridge is the Centennial Bridge, built at Iowa Avenue, just probably a little north of where the current bridge is at, in 1876, which was the 100th anniversary of the American Revolution. So I threw that in there just in case anybody was unclear why you call it the Centennial Bridge. And that bridge served until about 1915, 1916, when it came down. Now, other bridges that we're well familiar with in Iowa City, the Burlington Street Bridge. This is the old one, built in 1860. And according to one source, in 1863, it was collapsed by a herd of cows. Somebody was herding their cattle across the bridge, and it went down. They put it back up, and in 1915, the bridge was fully retired. Now, if you know any more about that story, if you've got the papers from 1863, I'd love to hear about it. I don't know anything. The one source just mentions it very briefly. That bridge was then, of course, replaced with this beautiful concrete bridge in 1916, and concrete arch, closed spandrel, And if you look at this bridge right now, and you think about the rehab that was done to it in 1986, the shape is the same. It's opened here. The new bridge is opened here in the spandrels, whereas this is closed, and you've got the metal guardrail instead of the concrete. But the general shape, the general silhouette of the bridge is pretty much the same. This bridge was built for $52,700 in 1916, and it served until 1986. So less than $1,000 a year, minus maintenance. That's not a bad deal. That's a well-engineered bridge, considering how quickly Iowa City grew and the sort of traffic that bridge then had to carry. One of the scarier bridges from Iowa City's history is the old Benton Street Bridge. And this was on Benton Street from 1902 to about 1949. And it wasn't always this precarious to come across it. This is the building material for the new bridge. They're going to tear this bridge down. So that's why you don't usually store all your planks on a bridge. There is a little sign there above the pedestrian's head that says, "No trucks allowed." But of course, at this point, you're on the bridge with that truck. So if you've missed the signs before that, you might be a little committed. And it's possible that it's wood, or if not planks, steel and planks. It doesn't, anybody remember this bridge? Anybody walk across this bridge? All right. This bridge was also the Ryerson Bridge, where it went into Ryerson Mill before Ryerson Mill burned down. And then, of course, this bridge was replaced in 1949 by the new bridge, which doesn't look at all scary. This is the same general view as the same bridge. Now, what's remarkable about this bridge, and we have a whole photo gallery devoted to the deconstruction of the old bridge and the construction of this new bridge on the DOT Historical Archives, not because this bridge is a design wonder. It's not beautiful to look at necessarily. It's very functional. But it was the first bridge that was entirely welded in Iowa. Now, that doesn't sound like a big deal, but normally you would take pieces of steel and you would rivet them or bolt them together and that sort of thing. And so America didn't have too many welded bridges prior to the Second World War, just a few scattered about, and then it started to take off again afterward. And the same person who designed this bridge and built this one here in 1949 in Iowa City then went on to design the entirely welded all-aluminum bridge that was in Des Moines over Interstate 80 in the 50s that was taken down after about 30 or 40 years of service. So it was a big deal at the time, and engineers would geek out about the fact that all this substructure was welded together. So and of course now that bridge is 4 lanes wide, and it's a slightly different bridge. So let's move on from bridges and talk about safety for a little bit. Because while you're creating all these roads for the cars and the tractors and trucks to use, you also have to start worrying about people running into each other and crashing into things. And one of the first things that the Iowa Highway Commission started doing in the mid-20s was painting a stripe down the center of the line, because they were building these nice roads and they were paving them and they were putting a nice high crown on them so the water would run off. But you get on that hike, you get out here on the county roads, some of them got that real high crown, and you sort of feel like you're riding like this at a little bit of angle, and you let yourself creep over the middle so you level out the car. You get a head-on collision every so often in that sort of scenario if people aren't paying attention to where they are on the lane. And so the Highway Commission found a very brave employee to sit on this paint machine backward with traffic coming from behind him while somebody else drives, painting that line down the road. And they were black until the mid-1950s when we realized, black lines in the rainy dark really aren't very visible. So then we went to the reflectorized yellow lines that we're all so familiar with. It took about 3 years to repaint all of Iowa's primary roads to get them from black to yellow. Now what would that look like finished? It would look like this. This is US Highway 161 in Johnson County. Anybody know what road US Highway 161 would now be? This used to be the main road to Cedar Rapids. 218? No, that's what we think of it as now. This is North Dubuque Street. If this picture is in fact north of town, it's North Dubuque Street. If it's south of town, it's either South Riverside Drive or Oak Crest Hill Road going down to Hills. Because this is just 2 little lanes. And you can see, if you go and you look on the historical maps, you can see how our main path to Cedar Rapids shifts westward when we get to 218 and 380. But this original route took us right up through North Liberty, right north of town, a little curve over to North Liberty, up through Shueyville, and up to Cedar Rapids. And roads we don't even think about using anymore. We run over on 80 across to 380 and up we go. So that's always fun. And US 161 is now US 151. That US 161 used to run all the way to Dubuque, and we now think of it as 151 instead. So transportation is a dynamic system. Even when you think, okay, we're going to pave that and it's going to last 50 or 100 years, things still happen. Population centers shift, traffic volume explodes, you need a different type of road. The numbering changes because it interferes with other numbers, or we think we've got a better system, those sorts of things. People often call the DOT library and ask me, when did Iowans first have to have a driver's license? Well, the answer to that is 1932. Unless you were a truck driver or bus driver or other chauffeur, then you had to have a license since 1919. And you got your license and you had a little badge. You wore it on your hat or on your coat. But this is a picture of a still existing paper copy of a driver's license from 1933. And because government documents at the time were made out of nice heavy bond paper, lots of cotton rag in that, and they last for a good long time. Although even though it was folded up in your wallet. What's interesting about these licenses is not only was there the license, and then up there you see the 7-digit number that gave your county and the number of the license. There's a little fold, there's a crease here. And over on this side, there was 3 tabs. And every time you got a moving violation, the sheriff would write your violation on that tab, because that tab also had your license number on it, stick it in his book, send it to central processing in Des Moines. He would turn your license over and write on the back of your license the date and the violation on your license. So when you ran out of tabs, you were basically out of points, and you had to go back to the sheriff's office, because they were the ones who were responsible for this at the time, and say, I'll never do it again, and you would get a new license. The minimum age for driver's licenses at the time was 15 years old, and in 1932, if you could walk to the sheriff with your application, and they looked it over, and you said, yeah, I've been driving for years, I've got lots of experience, you got grandfathered in. That's one of the ways that term comes about, getting the grandfather clause, is if you already showed that you could drive, or you convinced them that then you got your license without having to take a test. Regular driver's education for teenagers in Iowa public schools didn't come around until the late 1960s. So there was a lot of years there that we were all sort of expecting that you learned on the farm, because many of us did. Many of us were rural kids, and we learned on the farm long before we ever got our license. So the other thing about this lecture is there's a test. I never say that until we get to this part of the lecture, because by this point you're already pretty well in your seats and you're not going to run for the door. I don't expect you to know. I encourage people to guess. I'm very happy with that, but I'm going to ask just a few trivia questions throughout the rest of the lecture, and I hope that you learn a little bit from them and you enjoy and you play along. So the first automobiles to arrive in the state of Iowa didn't arrive until 1899, and they were featured up at the Lynn County Fair up near Cedar Rapids. They probably came on a train. They probably didn't come across the roads, because you'd want them clean for the fair, right? And they were slow to catch on in the state, but they did catch on, and the legislators saw that cars were going to catch on. And so they decided, well, if we're going to build these roads and bridges better, we need to raise a little tax money from that, and so we'll start having people register their cars and trucks. So in what year did Iowa first require that cars and trucks display a license plate or tags? Was it 1900? Just raise your hand anytime you hear an answer you like. Was it 1904? Was it 1908? A bunch? Was it 1912? The majority of the room went for 1908. The one person who guessed 1904 was correct. Earlier than most people think. Most people guess later, and for good reason, I think, and I'll explain that in just a minute. The original plate wasn't a plate. It was a disc. It was a steel disc about this big around, about 3 inches, and it had a number on it, and you took that disc to your local general store or hardware store, and they sold you the house numbers and the leather blank, and they would either put it together for you, or you'd take it home to the garage and you'd put your license plates together and you'd hang them on the front and the back, and then you'd screw that disc to the dashboard of your car, and that became permanent for that year. And then you'd do it again later on. So if you're on eBay and someone says, I have a metal license plate from Iowa from 1910, don't believe it because Iowa didn't start stamping out plates until 1911. If it was before 1911, it was a disc and it should be round. It shouldn't be rectangular like we know it now. So buyer beware. Oh, and what was I going to explain? Oh, and that was the other thing. But no, I'm not going to spoil that because we want to go to the next question. Then I'll explain why people tend to guess later. How many cars were registered in the state of Iowa in 1904? The legislator looking ahead, thinking, okay, we're going to start registering cars. How many cars were registered in 1904? Was it just one? How about 582? 931? 1398. Okay, so it's between C and B. Most of the room went for C and B. And it's, in fact, 931. Like anyone's going to know that, aside from me. So don't feel bad if you didn't know. And this is the very first gasoline-powered car registered in the state of Iowa. Built by Osage jeweler George Frazee, and the Mitchell County Museum still has this car. It runs. They get it out every year for their parade. It goes around the block, and it goes back in the museum. Now, the license plate, of course, isn't original. That's fairly new. Frazee hand-built the car. I mean, he bought the parts, but he hand-built the carriage and whatnot. He was a jeweler. So if this is one of the 931 cars registered in 1904, why would people tend to guess later? Well, I said cars were slow to catch on in the state of Iowa when they first appeared in 1899. But by 1914, there were 147,000 registered vehicles in the state of Iowa, giving Iowa the title of the highest registration per capita, per person of any state in the Union at the time. Now, of course, we didn't hold on to that title for very long because other states have a much larger population and bigger land mass and more cars and more roads. But in 1914, Iowa was car crazy and led the nation. Where would George have driven that car? Well, it would have been on dirt road, more than likely, or it might have been on one of Iowa's many historic auto routes. Now, let's be clear: auto routes are not roads. Auto routes are routes. How to get from point A to point B that pass by as many gas stations, hotels, restaurants, and campgrounds as people think they can make money from. It hasn't changed a whole lot since then. But these private routes, these weren't set up by the state. These were set up by cities and automobile clubs and folks who liked to drive. And they would pick out like the river-to-river route from Davenport to Council Bluffs. And towns would vie for where it got routed through their town. The Lincoln Highway also is celebrating its 100th year anniversary this year. There was a big battle between Cedar Rapids and Marion about whether the Lincoln Highway went through Cedar Rapids or went through Marion. They were vying with the private corporations, road associations, to get the road to come through their town because it meant tourism. Already, as soon as the car is invented, people are thinking tourism because they're thinking, I can go where I want, when I want, on my own time rather than getting on the train. There's a certain level of freedom there that people wanted to enjoy. And once the Iowa Highway Commission came to be in 1914, one of the rules it set was you can have your private road associations and you can have your designated routes. You just two things. You got to register with the state and tell us the route. Where does it go? And you have to send us a picture of your blazing, of your marking that you paint on the telephone poles and telegraph poles so people know where to go. Because if you look at this on our website, so many of these things look a lot alike. And it would be hard to tell. And many of the names are very similar. It would be hard to know where you're going. And that was to help try to keep down fighting and sabotage. Because some people would go out with that paint over the marking that's already there, paint their marking over the top of it. And you had to pay $5 to register. That was it. It was very little. And many of these routes still exist. We talk about them in Iowa. If you get the Iowa Scenic Byways Handbook, you can go on the DOT website, download that right to your navigation device, and follow like the Lincoln Highway or the River Road or some of the other great byways the Iowa Valley. Last week when I came down to the Amana Colonies for Mayfest, I took the Iowa Valley way from up near Tama down through to Marengo. So there's lots of fun and interesting scenic routes that you can take. And those routes and names all sort of came from, as I mentioned, all history is local, It came from the fact that most people called a road by where it got them to and from. So here in Johnson County, looking at the 1912 Hubinger's Road Atlas for Johnson County, you've got names that are, pretty utilitarian. The Iowa City and Washington Road, what we think of as Highway 1 nowadays. The Waterloo and Keokuk Belt Line, it really didn't go around, it wasn't belting anything, it was kind of longer than that. The Conrad and Eastern Road, way up here by Oxford in the very western part, and also in the very western part, the Victor, Williamsburg, and Oxford Cutoff. Very descriptive. You know where you're going to go. Of course, if you're in Iowa City, it's the Washington Road, and if you're in Washington, it's the Iowa City Road, because otherwise you're going to get lost. You're never going to get out of Iowa City if you're on the Iowa City Road. But not all of these routes paid their $5 in 1914 or in the years after that, up to 1925, or registered with the state. So some of these are lost because of neglect. They didn't want to go through with it. Others get absorbed into other routes, taken over by other folks, and whatnot. One of the interesting things about looking at, I love the old map questions. People call me, when did this road change its route, and these sorts of things. Looking in more closely at that county map from 1912, you see that our county, that Johnson County has changed quite a bit too. And Johnson County, as the original capital of the state, has more than 40, or around 40 ghost towns and unused place names. The places that we used to have for towns, names we used to have for towns, but we don't have anymore. 40 seems like a lot. Dubuque County, however, which is the oldest area of European settlement in the state of Iowa, what we now call Iowa, has more than 80 ghost towns. So, and it's hard to capture, because while one or two of the references I have include ghost towns like Oasis and Ives and Morfordsville over there, none of them captured mid-river up here by Sioux Falls, or Minnehaha over here near Iowa City. Between Iowa City and Coralville, in the big oxbow of the river, just down from the water plant, is Minnehaha. Now, on this same map, if you read down in here, it says Minnehaha Clubhouse. So maybe it was just the country club or whatever. I don't know. It's one of those things. If anybody knows, I'd be interested in finding out those stories. So of those registered routes, though, 12 of those came through Johnson County in one area or another, and 10 of them into Iowa City, which makes sense. It was the old capital. It's where the university was at. It's an important location in the county. And these are the various blazings for the road. So we have, starting sort of at the top and working our way left to right, we have the Burlington Way, which is this orange line here. We have the Detroit, Lincoln, and Denver Road, the DLD. Very descriptive. It runs from Detroit to Lincoln, Nebraska, on to Denver. Okay, good. We know where we're going. The Diagonal Trail, which does run at a bit of a diagonal, but doesn't really tell you where you're going to go. You've got to have their brochure. You've got to know where you're going. There's the Diamond Trail, the Green Crescent, the Herbert Hoover Highway, which we're all still familiar with, the Mississippi Valley Highway, which runs in the same corridor as the Burlington Way. What's MD? Muscatine Des Moines Short Line, which just cuts through Johnson County down here, where Johnson County extends down past Washington County. The Red Ball Route, running up and out of town. The Red X Route, that pink one running out there. River to River Road, which I talked about, that runs Davenport to Council Bluffs, and the White Way 7 Highway, also running pretty much along that same path as the River to River Road. Now, you'll notice all these lines come into downtown Iowa City, and it would be really hard to imagine how confusing one of those poles looked like with all the blazings on it if we didn't actually have the picture of downtown Iowa City with one of those poles on it. So this is at Washington and Dubuque Street, right outside the Jefferson Hotel, in 1912, 1916. There's some debate on the date on my couple of sources, and there are about 8 routes marked on that road, on that telephone pole. And then you can see around the corner here, the River to River Road is marked again, so you know you've made the right turn. that you're staying on the river-to-river road. But the idea was to have the highways come through your town because that was going to bring business to your town. And some of these we're not even sure about, like the C on top and the white circle. We haven't been able to identify those with any surety. Some of the others, river-to-river, the diagonal, the M&M, the red X, and the black diamond. Some of those we do know. So, while we're still talking about safety, question I also get asked is when was the first automobile fatality registered or recorded in the state of Iowa? And this is based on newspaper accounts and recordings, so this is what we think we know. Was it 1903? A couple for that. 1905? A bunch more for that. 1907? And 1909. So those of you who picked 1905 were correct. And this is a picture from that scene. And there's a little caption up in the corner that somebody from the Highway Commission added in the 50s, and I want to read it for you because it describes what we're seeing. This is the first chapter of a tragic serial story that will never have an ending, the story of Iowa's first fatal motor vehicle accident. It occurred 3 miles south of Hampton on what is now Highway 65 on September 29, 1905. The driver, F.A. Harriman, a Hampton attorney, was killed when traveling 30 miles an hour. 30 miles an hour would have been the top speed of any car you and I could have bought off the lot at that time. That would have been fast. He struck a bridge and went over the embankment. His companions, A.W. Bede, G.W. Bede, H.W. Harrison, and N.A. Emgles were injured. The car is believed to have been an Oldsmobile. The fact that there were 5 people in that car and only 1 died was pretty amazing because seatbelts, don't even think about it. Open top. Crumple zones? No. The fact that they were wedged in there on the seat wasn't even necessarily a comfort because the seat came to, unfastened from the car. So automobile safety has a long way to go at this point and over the course of the 20th century up to currently. This is a graph of the automobile-related fatalities in the state of Iowa from 1925 when we started keeping really good records up until 2012, and then I added in 2013's total here. And you can see the trend line shows that we have this huge peak in automobile fatalities in around 1970, and then it drops off pretty dramatically after that. Anybody want to guess why 1970 is such a deadly year? Seatbelt. The first seatbelt law is 1968. So most cars on the road in 1970 still don't have seatbelts. What else? Speed. The interstate speed at that time is 75 miles an hour during the day, 65 at night. Up into the late 1950s, it was whatever was reasonable and prudent. That's almost a quote from Iowa law. So it's like during the day and then a little less at night. And so why did we have this huge drop-off starting in 1974? Anybody remember that?
55 miles per hour.
55 miles an hour speed limit that Nixon signed because of the Arab oil embargo and the gasoline crisis in the 1970s. And that speed limit doesn't go back up until the Clinton administration on the interstates. And in between time, cars get safer. There's seat belts, there's airbags, there's crumple zones. Although there are a lot more big trucks and a lot more little cars on the road together, and so there's still some disparity, and which is why the trend line tends to flatten out a bit in recent decades. The Iowa Department of Transportation and the other departments of transportation around the country are part of a Towards Zero Deaths campaign that we're trying to get those interstate deaths down to nothing by engineering the safest roads possible and the safest vehicles possible. But we still have factors working against us. One of them is the cell phone and distracted driving and all that sort of bad stuff. But we can see that in 2013, Iowa had just 317 automobile fatalities, which was a low since World War II during rationing and when people weren't allowed to drive as much. So a much better year. We're headed in the right direction. We still have a lot of engineering, a lot of education to go.
1970 had to be the high horsepower, poor handling.
Mm-hmm.
Because the cars were horrible, but they were very powerful.
They were very powerful, and I think the Insurance Institute has a video on YouTube if you want to go find it. I haven't found it yet, but I've read about it. They take a car from 1969 and they take a car from 2009, relative same body size, and they crash them into the same barrier at the same speed, with dummies in them. The dummies in the car from 1969, bits and pieces flying everywhere because it's mangled. The car from 2009, the dummies walk away, to use a bad phrase, because the cars are so much better engineered. Even horsepower aside, it's the body construction, the safety features, all that. We've come a long way in the 20th century, but automobile fatalities are still, one of the leading causes of death in the United States. So, you take your, and we don't have people wearing silver ribbons like with pink ribbons or something for automobile fatalities, even though it's a very high number. And it's something we have to, that as state DOTs, we're trying to come up with solutions for. One of those is Iowa's 511. During the winter, I hope you used this before you went out and traveled. Also, during the summer, it's going to be very useful because one of the things that you can find on Iowa 511 is where are the construction zones that I can go around. I happen to know today that construction is starting on Interstate 80 just east of I-35, so I took US 30 across. I was like, I'm not going to be in the work zone. Safer for me, safer for the workers there, safer for everybody else. I went around the other way. Please do download 511, and when you're pulled over, take a look, figure out your route, and then drive safely on. So I want to hit on a few more modes of transit in the last few minutes because we've talked a lot about automobiles, but as I said at the start, that's the story of the 20th century in Iowa and in the nation, in fact. But let's hit on these few up here while we can. So I mentioned that you could get a steamboat up the Iowa River to where we are here in Iowa City. Iowa is, of course, bordered by two navigable rivers, the Missouri and the Mississippi, and you could get a boat up parts of the Turkey, the Maquoketa, the Cedar, the Skunk, and the Des Moines. Well, part of the reason Des Moines is where it's at is you could get a boat that far up. In fact, you could get one up to Boone, which is just parallel with Ames on US 30. And there was a big plan for a while to build 30 locks and dams and several canals on the Des Moines River between Keokuk and Des Moines. Only 4 of those locks and dams were ever built, and none of them are in operation anymore. That plan sort of fell through. But we know on the Mississippi that there are 30 locks and dams from Minnesota down until it gets deep enough farther south to be uncontrolled. 10 of those border the state of Iowa. And anybody know how deep the channel is in the middle of the Mississippi? It's a lot less than you think. It's 9 feet. That's all that's dredged for barge traffic is 9 feet, because a fully laden barge only drafts a few feet, 4 or 5 feet. And so there's still plenty of room under there for the barge to clear, which amazed me when I first learned about that. And that project came in the 20s and 30s, which allowed fairly regular freight traffic on the river up to Minnesota, down through Iowa, and farther south, while the weather's warm. Now, and given the latest report we saw yesterday on climate change, that might be all year round, anytime soon. For many decades of the 1800s, the Mississippi was the main way lumber came down from Minnesota down into Iowa. In fact, the reason Clinton in the late 1800s had more millionaires per capita than any other municipality in the nation was because lumber came down the Mississippi and stopped at Clinton to be sawn up into boards, and then put on the trains going either direction out of Clinton or floated across. They used to put railroad cars on ferries and ferry them across the Mississippi so they could hook them up and run them. Isn't that crazy? When you think about how much weight's in there, it always amazes me to think about that. So river transportation was important, and it was important for Iowa. This is a picture of Iowa City. The steamboat Ripple arrives in Iowa City, painted by Mildred Pelzer in the 1930s, but the event that it chronicles takes place in June 1841, when the first steamboat pulls up from where it had docked down by where Hills is at now and comes up to Iowa City. A banquet was held the following day to celebrate the arrival of the steamboat, and the steamboat era in Iowa City lasts about 25 years, up to about 1866. Sadly, the steamboat Iowa City, on her maiden sort of test run, burned to the water. But at that same time, the rail line had already been into Iowa City for 10 years. And so steamboats, and given the vagaries of the Iowa River, when it's dry, it's too shallow, and when it's wet, it's a torrent. So the steamboat age didn't last all that long, but there was a steamboat landing area and a steamboat works here in Iowa City for a couple of decades. Water, as I mentioned, for 1,200 years, people got around on their feet or on the land or on water. And water helped determine where Iowans settled early on. So here we have a rough map of the navigable Iowa waterways in 1860. This is taken from William Thompson's History of Transportation in Iowa that the DOT published in 1988. And we look next at, we superimpose the population of Iowa in 1850 over that river map, and you can see pretty well that population follows the rivers, or it's maybe a day or two travel east or west of the river, and coming in from the Missouri River to the east. But there's whole counties in Iowa that have no European American settlers in them. Many Native American nations, but no European American settlers, which is what this map actually captures. I should be more clear about that. And this is what the population in Iowa looks like in 1870 after the train comes in. This is what train transportation means, is that white Americans can move across and settle all over Iowa. And of course, you still have your large population centers, Des Moines, the Quads, Davenport, Muscatine area, Keokuk, and Dubuque, because those were some of the first places that got the train, as well as here we are in Johnson County and Iowa City. But that was the sort of impact, and that's the same sort of impact that we see with highways today. Is it actually determines where towns locate, where people move. You wanted the railroad to come through your town. Some towns picked up and moved to be closer to the railroad. Other towns became ghost towns because the railroad didn't come through their area. Many towns in Iowa owe their name to the railroads. Ames, Iowa was named after an investor in a rail line. Blairstown was named after John Blair of the Chicago Great Western. This map shows the rail lines in Iowa in 1881. This is 5,000 miles of track in Iowa at the time. So we went from a very small number in the 1850s to 1881, 5,000 miles. And what's important about this map is by this point in 1881, we have the Transcontinental Rail Line. There are 10 rail lines that run east coast to west coast and cross the Mississippi. Of those 10, 5 cross through Iowa. What city to the east makes that the reason? Chicago, because that was where East Coast traffic funneled in and then headed out again, and Iowa's in a straight line west of Chicago on your way to the west coast. So you've got the Milwaukee line, the Illinois Central, the Chicago Northwestern, the Rock Island line, and the Burlington line, using their popular names, the names we know them of today, because talk about a mess. They changed hands and names over and over again before names that we know about today. All come through Iowa on their way farther west and out to the west coast. And that really drives settlement of Europeans to the west of the Mississippi in a way nobody's business. How many people know that in 1873 the very first train robbery west of the Mississippi happened in Iowa? Over here by Adair. The James gang robbed a train. Only made off with a couple of $1,000s instead of the $40,000 they were expecting to get, but first train robbery west of the Mississippi. Of course, Iowa City, being the state capital, got rail line in 1856, as we talked about, as we mentioned before, and it was a push. The contract said that the Mississippi and Missouri Railroad Company was going to have its rail line completed from Davenport to Iowa City by January 1st, 1956. They had promised it was in the contract. Midnight, December 31st, 1855, they've got tar barrels lit. They're still laying those last bits of track in order to finish by midnight, finish a little bit later. And the first train pulls into Iowa City on January 3rd of 1856. Again, to big fanfare, to banquets and the whole bit. And of course, other rail lines have since, and the M&M was part of the Chicago Rock Island line. Other lines have come through, the Cedar Rapids and Iowa City line, the Iowa Interstate, the Muscatine and Iowa City Railway, Iowa City and Western, a number of different rail lines. And of course, one of the things as an undergraduate here at the University of Iowa, I was like, why isn't there a train that runs between Iowa City and Cedar Rapids? Well, there used to be, from 1904 to 1953. There's just not anymore. And that would have been so convenient. Well, not that there's a whole lot. No, I'm not even going to make any disparaging remarks about Cedar Rapids. But it would have been nice to be able to travel a little bit that didn't require a car, and that ceased to be in the 1950s. but that was an important mode of transportation for people, especially going to and from Cedar Rapids or to the various games. And that railroads set the tone of life for Iowans in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And then when it starts to compete with the automobile in the early 1900s, we see those first 5 decades or so where passenger rail hangs on until about the 1950s when passenger rail all but disappears from the state of Iowa. Now we just have the one Amtrak route running in the southern tier, but nothing else at the moment. 700 miles of rail line in 1860, jumps up to over 10,000 by 1915, and in 2011, less than 4,000 miles of active trackage in the state of Iowa. Now what's different is that the rail lines are sharing lines. They rent lines from each other. They operate on the same lines and pay the owner of the rail to use that line, so that actually from 1985 until today, and 1985 being sort of the midpoint of the farm crisis, right, when freight looked like it was done, we've seen 100% increase in the amount of freight that runs in and out. So in 1985, Iowa exported 52 million tons of freight and imported 90 million tons of freight by rail. Today, those numbers are on the order of 120 million tons of freight each direction. So a huge increase on much less track. So freight is making a comeback, and it makes sense. There's lots of efficiencies, and anything that helps get, as an old truck driver, anything that helps get trucks off the road, I'm in favor of. It wasn't particularly a career that I enjoyed all that much, and would be happy to see fewer trucks on the road. Now, we can't talk about Iowa's railroads without talking about the Underground Railroad a little bit too, because Iowa had some small part to play in the Underground Railroad. We know of at least 100 people escaping from slavery in Missouri and Kansas that made their way through Iowa. And of course, because it's the Underground Railroad, people didn't necessarily tell. So there's stories, there's parts of history that are lost to us. But that included trips through Johnson County, 6 or 7 trips through Johnson County by John Brown and some of the fugitives that he was helping to escape between 1856 and 1859 before the raid on Harper's Ferry. And of course, 1856 is important because the train line had come from Davenport to Iowa City, and Brown would sneak him and his followers and the fugitives over to the PD settlement, to Springdale, to West Branch, to the Quaker settlements, and then get on the train there and ride out of town. In fact, some people looking for the bounty almost caused a riot in Iowa City in 1859, thinking that they were going to collect a $3,000 bounty on these fugitive slaves. Fortunately, other folks in Iowa City who were pro-abolition hid Brown and his Confederates until they could get on a sealed boxcar and run to Chicago from West Branch. But as I mentioned, as we noticed on the one graph, at one point we had 11,000 miles of track, and now we only have 4,000. What do you do with all that abandoned track line? Because the thing you know about rail bed is it's smooth and it's elevated, and most of the time it's out of the water. Well, in Iowa, as in many other states, those abandoned rail beds, when they're not being turned back into arable land, are being turned into bicycle and multi-use trails. Iowa has 1,700 miles of multi-use trails. Many of them are on old rail lines. Not so much here in Johnson County, because a lot of our rail still operates, and there's just a couple of rail trail conversions out here in the far east part of the county, at least according to that map, and that map's a little bit dated. But if you get a bicycle map on the back table back there, or go on our website and look for the bicycle map, you could ride one of the many beautiful trails in Iowa, or you can check out the Rails to Trails Conservancy online and check out their guides to rail trails from around the country. And it's some great scenery. I mean, you're sort of in the backyards of a lot of places. It's away from many times the main roads. You get to go through some of the old tunnels and viaducts and things like that. And it's a beautiful ride, and I highly, highly recommend it. You don't think much about public transportation when you think about Iowa, unless you live in one of the larger cities. But recent reports tell us a couple important things. 45% of Americans have absolutely no access to mass transit of any sort, mass public transit of any sort. That's according to the American Society of Civil Engineers in their latest report card. Iowa is one of the few states in the country where all of its counties have public transits. There are 35 public transit bureaus in the state of Iowa covering every one of our 99 counties. Now, if you live way up here in Region 3 in the far northwest, the bus isn't coming every 10 minutes. It's not coming every half hour. You have to call and make an appointment, and the bus will come and get you where you need to be. But as we continue to age and age healthily, but maybe not to the point where we can drive. My hearing's already starting to go. At some point, no one's going to want to give me a driver's license, but I'm still going to need to get around. We're going to need to look for more mass transit solutions that are a bit more often, or can actually manage to get us from the Northwest down here to, say, the University of Iowa Medical Centers in a reasonable amount of time. But it is a big state. It is, it's a pretty big footprint of land, and it does take 5 to 6 hours to cross it. So, we'll have to be thinking about those things. Some of that might include passenger rail or other things. You also don't think much about aviation in Iowa, unless you live down in Indianola and you're at one of the balloon festivals for aviation. But Iowa has some of its own fun facts for aviation. One of my favorites is the first person-carrying glider built in Iowa was in 1898 by a young man named Carl Bates in Clear Lake. He was 14. I think this is where we get the term grounded, because I don't think his mother knew what he was doing until after he'd done it, and I bet he never got to do it again. Fun things like that. And in 1945, the Iowa Aeronautics Commission was created for the same reason we created the Highway Commission. There were many, many more pilots returning from the war and private people taking up flying in 45, that we needed to have rules and regulations to keep pilots safe and build quality airports. There were just about 200 airports in Iowa in 1947. There's about 110 now. I'm abusing my privileges here. Okay, one more quick test. This machine, over its 100 years, let me put this in context. Over its 100 years, the Iowa State Highway Commission, the Iowa DOT, have made a number of contributions to highway engineering and construction and safety that have had national impact. Let me put it that way. This is one of those things. This very ugly machine is either a dune buggy, a tree row tree planter, a very short and ineffective corn detasseler, or a slip-form paver. Because this is a talk about transportation, it's the slip-form paver. Developed in 1949 by Jimmy Johnson and some other engineers at Iowa State Highway Commission, and which has come on to be of international importance. Doing old concrete work by hand and using forms, a good crew, that meant a lot of people, could do about 1,000 feet of concrete a day. That paver could do 5,000 feet of concrete a day. So that's a 500% increase just with that. And then the modern machines can do 2 to 4 lanes wide at one pass. And so that's really improved the productivity. And it's like those Disney films where like the cars are like right behind the pavers waiting for the cement to dry to drive. That's pretty much what it's like. We are engineering pavement now, concrete mixes and whatnot, where you can put a patch down and within 3 hours you can have traffic on it. So, because one of the hardest parts about doing any maintenance is you have to close the route for traffic. And we can't handle that. There's too much volume out there to do that for very long if we can help it. One of the other things that the Iowa State Highway Commission has contributed to transportation safety is one of these 4 signs are now national standard, but was developed in Ames at the Iowa State Highway Commission. Does anybody think it was the deer crossing sign? Okay, I'm going to ask you good Iowans to take a real close look at that deer's antlers and tells me who's going to put them on backward if they live in the state of Iowa. That's a national standard sign. I've got to talk to those folks about fixing that. So I'm going to let you change your answers. So don't worry about that. I won't count it against you. How many think it's the merge sign? How about the red stop sign? Couple. How about the no passing zone pennant? Okay, most people guessed for that. And in fact, developed in 1958 by the Governor's Safety Council in order to cut down on the number of head-on collisions and erratic passing maneuvers that were happening in no passing zones on 2-lane highways. Remember, 1958, we're just starting to build the interstate. That year, we were building the interstate. So most of the roads in Iowa are 2 lanes. What's special about where this sign is placed on the road in relationship to you as the driver? It's on your left. So when you're riding right on my tail, as I know you all did, because my truck is a little bit slower than your car, and you're looking around, where are you looking? You're looking over here on the left side. You're not looking at the no passing zone sign over here on the right that's blocked by the truck. In the first month that this sign was placed on US 30 from Clinton to Council Bluffs, the number of tickets written for erratic passing maneuvers or finishing a pass in a no passing zone went down 63%. It became statewide standard and was up all across the state in 3 months and became national standard by 1978. Oh, I'm killing me here. Too much to talk about. One more recent thing. Not only does transportation have an effect on people and their lived lives of the moment? Transportation and its infrastructure has an impact on the past and history, as well as the environment and the future. And sometimes you have to change your methods of building things because of the social impacts, not just the engineering impacts. And this is one of those cases. Prior to European settlement of Iowa, many, many native tribes lived here, many First Nations peoples, and their burial mounds are scattered across the state. At one point, there was about 50,000 of them. Now there are fewer than 10,000 remaining in the state because we've paved over them, plowed them under, what have you, without really paying attention. The old habit was to, if any at all, was to dig up the bones and the pottery and whatnot, artifacts, and send it over to the museum here at the university, rather than repatriate the bones. Had it been a European American, their bones would have been repatriated in a cemetery. And that was common practice up to the 1970s when Maria Pearson here, or Running Moccasins by her Sioux name, her husband worked for the Highway Commission, and he was telling her about a dig that they were on, preparing to build a road, and they'd come across some native remains and some European remains. The European remains were taken to a cemetery. The native remains were going to be sent to the university. And she said, she went to Governor Ray and said, hey, that's not fair. You know, you're not respecting our burial habits, our cultural habits. We'd appreciate it if you'd stop doing that. I'm sure she used slightly different language than that. But nonetheless, that was the gist. So that by 1976, working between Maria and Governor Ray and the Iowa DOT by that point, Iowa had the first in the nation native remains repatriation law that became the model for the national law that was enacted in 1990. So, you know, little social history there. In 1982, the Sioux Nation gifted to the Iowa DOT this calumet, this ceremonial pipe, in recognition of the change that the Iowa DOT had made and in the recognition of the new relationship. We now have regular native advisors. Maria worked in that position for many years until she passed, going out on surveys to make sure that, you know, we weren't violating any sacred remains and working with the First Nations when we had to build roads through their areas. And that calumet is on display in the DOT library. You're welcome to come see it anytime you like. I get to see it every day. So please do come and take a look. I'm going to skip over that beautiful bridge. Go take a look at the story about the US 20 bridge on our website. And I want to talk just a few minutes about the future so we have time for some questions. I talked about train and passenger train. The Iowa DOT has recently been working on a study of the return of more passenger rail service to the state of Iowa, higher speed passenger rail service. The federal government has money to give us to help us along that way. Chicago and Omaha would really like it if we would get on board because Chicago and Omaha want to link up train service between the two cities. Again, Iowa is in that direct path west of Chicago. But you know, we're not talking bullet train here. We're not talking 200 miles an hour, which is what I'd really like to see something. But we're talking 70 to 100 miles an hour. How many people have ridden the Amtrak in Iowa at all? You know that there are places on that route. I took it out to Denver myself not too long ago, where you're doing 5 miles an hour because there's slow orders on the track because the maintenance is so far in arrears that you can't go very fast. That's going to be a big hurdle if we're going to get to higher speed rail between Omaha and Chicago in about the same time it would actually take you with all the security and getting to the airport and getting through the airport and getting off the airport and getting to Chicago. If we're going to have those times be slightly equal, the trains are going to have to move pretty fast. And so we've been studying this. We've looked at a whole bunch of different routes. The most obvious one is the one through the higher population centers on Chicago. And of course, that's one of those things that gets talked about at the legislative and gubernatorial level, but hasn't gone very far yet. So we'll see. I'm a big fan, but that's speaking personally, not as a representative of the Department of Transportation for the cameras. But it's one of those things that we may have to see if we're really going to do something about climate change due to carbon output from vehicles. We're going to have to get more mass transit and get more freight off of the highways and onto trains. Roundabouts. How many of y'all been on the roundabout over there in Coralville or in Iowa City? How many of you liked the experience? All right, all the hands go down. I love that. Most of the hands go down. It's not true. That happens in every room. And part of the reason is we don't do a very good job of educating people about how roundabouts are supposed to work. The idea behind a roundabout is that you take a four-way intersection. Now, engineers study every piece of geometry, as we call that, as we call road designs, and look for points of conflict or where you're likely to run into another car. In a four-way intersection with traffic moving in both directions and left turns going on, there are 32 points of conflict, 32 places you're likely to run into somebody. And you've got to have traffic lights. You've got to expend all that electricity and infrastructure. If we take out all those traffic lights, put in a few yield signs, put an island in the middle of it, put some striping on the ground, we can decrease the number of conflict points from 32 to 8. 75% increase in safety, and you eliminate all the electrical infrastructure. You're going to see a lot more of these besides the 4 in Coralville and the couple here now in Iowa City. What we don't do is educate people on how to use them, because you've got to yield going in, and you've got to get yourself positioned to make your turn. And what I envision, and I'm hoping anybody at the DOT who's watching this now in time for the state fair coming up, is that we paint a giant roundabout on the ground at the state fair, and we get 8 bumper cars, and once you get through it without running into anybody else, you get a little roundabout sticker on your license that says you're roundabout certified. Because when Ottumwa, any place that's got one of the new roundabouts, people are often sort of mad because they haven't had a lot of education on them. But we do have guides if you want to check out any of the links up there. And I meant to bring some, and I'm sorry I didn't, but download those or give me a shout, and I will send those to you. Another thing that we're trying to do to improve safety is eliminate crashes at left turns. That's what roundabouts are about. That's what the flashing left yellow arrow is about. How many of y'all seen the flashing yellow arrow like up by Pearson, right? Is that where it's at? The idea is that the flashing yellow arrow replaces the green dot when you're making a left turn that says yield because traffic's coming on. Because any good sign or signal should have one meaning, because that's easy for human beings to process. You know what a stop sign is from the back. You don't have to see it's red. You just have to know its shape. You know someone's going to stop there. But when you're in this turn lane and you've got a green dot above your head, when you're turning, you're thinking, does that mean go, Charlie, go? It's my turn? Or do I have to yield? And often there's a sign there that says you've got to yield. But over here it says go, go, go. Get through the intersection. People are behind you. Get moving. The flashing left arrow would replace that. And you'll see it around, and we hope that with the flashing yellow arrow, there'll be fewer left turn accidents, because that's still one of the most serious and frequent accidents we have in cities around the country. So, and it should just be, everything should be arrows. There should be a red arrow that says stop, a solid yellow arrow that says the lights are going to be red, the flashing yellow arrow that says yield to oncoming traffic, and a solid green that says make the left turn, go. We have intersections I've been at where you get both the green arrow and the red dot. Am I stopping or going? That's, those sorts of things need to be re-engineered to make it more clear and safer. How many of y'all went on our website this winter and looked to see where the snowplows were operating? A couple of you, good. If you go to DOT Travel, Winter Driving, you can see where the snowplows are operating in the state of Iowa and which direction they're headed in. So you can look and see, well, is the plow in my area operating? Has it been through? Do I know? Yes, I can make a good decision. Or it hasn't come my area way, maybe I better wait. Or there are 400 plows out, maybe it's not safe to drive at all. Maybe I'll call in sick today, which would be a whole lot better for all of us. So please do use those safety features, because that's really where we're going to go if we're going to eliminate the fatalities.
Question.
Sure.
What is that piece of equipment between the two plows?
This is the side tow plow, the tow plow as it's called.
The tow plow?
Mm-hmm.
Is that
TOW.
on the front truck?
No. It is normally a trailer directly in line. This is an amazing piece of equipment, and being a little bit of a road geek here and now, that normally this is just a trailer that follows directly behind this plow truck. But when you engage the hydraulics and put it into plow mode, the axles shift and it turns out from behind the truck and comes alongside of it at about a 45-degree angle there, 30 to 45-degree angle, and plows the next lane over.
Are those in use all over the state?
They're coming. This is, actually, I think I borrowed this picture from the state of Missouri. Thanks, guys. But we've been using them now starting this year, and we'll get more and more of them because it allows us to plow more roadway with fewer workers, and that's always one of the issues, is how many people do we have available to run the plows? Because if you have a long-term storm, People are getting in the overtime, people are getting tired, we're not getting enough rest. We need to increase, given how severe some of our storms are, it's hard to get enough people into the trucks that are qualified. So with the tow plows, we're hoping to solve some of those labor shortage issues and get the roads cleared.
So you're using that in the Des Moines and Ames area?
All over the state. We've got a few of them spread out over the state, and we'll be getting more. You'll see more and more of those.
Okay.
Oh, good, I'm done. You can check out things on our website, grab a bibliography. We're on the social media. I recommend, especially Iowa, get on and follow Iowa 511. We will send directly to your phone road conditions, which is always handy when the weather's bad. And you can email me at the DOT library or send me a question. Put a stamp on it. Send me a letter. I'll be happy to answer your questions. I am the only dedicated transportation librarian in the state of Iowa. Whoop-de-doop. Which means I handle a lot of specialized reference questions. I get calls from Dubuque and other places, Dubuque Public Library and other places say, do you happen to have this? Or or the state library calls up, I have somebody on chat. They have a question about their driver's license. So I get those sorts of things a lot. And I'm happy to answer those questions either during the day, during business hours, really only during business hours. But if you email them to me or if you call me or get a hold of me some other way, I'm happy to answer those questions. Thanks so much for sitting through a very long lecture. And now I'd like to take a few minutes for questions.
Oh, can you repeat his question?
Yeah, go ahead.
How strictly are they going to enforce the license plate, like covering of the county or the birthday?
So the question is, how strictly are they going to enforce the new law that just passed with your license plate holder can't cover the county on the plate? Well, now, it is a primary offense. They can use that as the main reason to pull you over. So, just as, like, if you're not seatbelted. So how strictly they're going to enforce it, I'm not sure. One of the questions that I had when this was announced was, well, what about those of us who have specialty plates? There's no county on there. If you've got a Cyclone or a Hawkeye branded plate, there's no county on there. I'm not sure it makes a lot of sense in a lot of ways. But again, those are sorts of things that people at a higher pay grade.
Exactly is the problem?
I honestly not sure anymore because when license
Large numbers or?
when license plates were first issued, the counties were all numbered in the same way that they still, and that morphed over time. But what is Johnson County? 52. And it made a difference because we would print the plates, we'd put the 52 on there, and then we would only print enough plates with numbers that we figured out how many cars were going to be in that county. And and that meant very limited numbers. You could go up to 10,000 up to 99,000. With the 3 letters and 3 number combination that we have now, the 6 digits, we can do 17 million plates in the state of Iowa. We're not in any danger of hitting that. And they're unique. So why you still need to know the county when you actually know what counties have which 3-letter prefixes, I'm not sure. I really don't know enough about it. Other questions?
When you were a truck driver, what was the most annoying thing car drivers did?
Being on the same road that I was on. Oh, so the question was, the question was, when I was a truck driver, what was the most annoying thing that cars did at the same time? And the question, and I'm not being facetious when I say that cars being on the same road as truck is not a good plan. Truck drivers are licensed professionals. They are out there to work on the roads. Why there are not separated freight and passenger roadways, I do not understand. Because anytime you I can't tell you how many times people in their cars think that they can just throw those 4 tons of material around at 80 miles an hour and that I'm going to be able to stop on a dime and not run them over. I had a lot of people sort of cut you off, and they don't understand the physics. 80,000 pounds moving even just at 55 miles an hour takes hundreds of feet to come to a stop. And if you cut in front of me to get to an exit and then jam on your brakes, you're in that hundreds of feet zone. You're hurt or dead. Anything we can do To disassociate passenger traffic and freight traffic, I'm in favor of. Again, personal opinion. Texting was an annoyance. Putting on makeup, my favorite was the people with three hands. Coffee's in the one hand is putting on the makeup, the third hand is reached around belting the kid in the back seat, and none of the eyes are looking forward. People do too much. People used to ask me, well, what do you do when you drive? That's what I am there to do. I am paid to move that freight. I am paid to drive safely from one place to another. That's really all I should be doing. Now, I did listen to 2,500 audiobooks. I think that's perfectly fair, except for the times that I was bawling because characters died in Harry Potter, and Dobby, Dobby died. Kids were looking up, Mommy, why is that truck driver crying? Because I was just bawling. And probably I should have pulled over. Really you're only there to drive. That's why you should be in the car. You should be getting from one point to another. And you should be thinking every moment, what dangers are ahead of me? What could possibly happen? The most dangerous mile is the one ahead. It's a cliche. It's one they talk to us about at truck driving school. But it's true. You got through that last mile. It's all good. It's the next one that you don't know about: the dog, the deer, the kids playing on the side of the street, the pothole, the tire that's going to blow on your vehicle, somebody else. On the way down here, we were leaving. This absolutely true story. My partner and I, we got in the car. We left the DOT. She picked me up so we could come down here this afternoon. There was a traffic light at the driveway of the DOT in Ames to get onto Grand Avenue. We have a green light. We are coming through the parking lot. We have a green light. We are getting ready to get in the right turn lane. We have a green light. There goes somebody in their SUV right on through that red light on Grand Avenue at 45 miles an hour in a 35 mile an hour zone, and hits the next light on a stop and roll through, and is disappeared down 4th before we can see him when we get down to that light. So it's people not driving when they're in their cars is the most annoying thing. I don't mean to be a little preachy, but tens of thousands of people die in their cars every year. Every time you get in the car, you take that chance. It's up around 40 or 50,000 a year. It's on the same level. It's on the same order as people who die at work every year. And yet where there's not huge campaigns about it. There is now, at the state and federal DOT level, the Towards Zero Deaths campaign. But we need people to cooperate too and be more conscious of what they're doing when they get in the car. And I will admit to my own distracted driving problems every so often too. We're all human, it happens. But we have to try to eliminate that because it's a chancy thing we're doing. Other questions?
It's about 3 airliners a week.
Yeah, right. We get excited about an airliner disappearing, but we die much more frequently on the highways than in the air. Other questions? Let's end on a happier note. Other questions?
Well, I have a question, but it's not very happy. What about the state of Iowa's roads and bridges?
Oh, so you read the structural deficiency report. Perfectly good question. 21%. Iowa. How many bridges does Iowa have? Anybody know? 24,700. That's because Iowa ain't flat. For those of you from the East Coast, Iowa's not flat. If you've ever had to walk it or bicycle it, you know it's not flat. It's rolling prairie, and some quite steep. Lots of rivers, lots of creeks, lots of streams. 24,000 bridges in the state. The Iowa Department of Transportation is responsible for more than 4,000 of those. The counties are responsible for another 19,000. The rest are in the cities and in private area and in parks. 21% of those 24,000 bridges are structurally deficient, according to the regular inspections that we go out and do. What does that mean? Does that mean it's going to fall down tomorrow? No. It doesn't mean that. It does mean that it's starting to show wear, that its maintenance level isn't keeping up with the traffic volume, and that we may actually have to put a weight restriction on that bridge. So certain traffic has to stay off. Think back to that picture, no trucks allowed on the bridge over Benton Street, right? We may have to do more of that. We have to decide, does Iowa need 24,000 bridges? Is that too many to maintain? Because they're on every road, and not every road gets used to the same, the average annual daily traffic count, to use one of our precise acronyms or phrases, isn't the same on Highway 1 in Iowa City as it is on Highway 1 down in Washington County, right? So Do we need all those bridges? Can routes be rerouted so that we're focused on major traffic flow areas for that sort of bridge infrastructure? And can we stop building bridges in other areas? Can we eliminate them altogether without having huge impacts on people? So those are questions we have to ask. And as people know, we're not getting the funding that we need to maintain. I mean, that's the other part of Maeve's question, sort of hidden in there, is what about the gasoline tax? The tax level has been frozen since 1989, and prices for everything else has gone up, for concrete and everything else has gone up. So we can't maintain what we had in 1989 with what we're getting paid today to do it, although we try. We squeeze every dime we can out, and we research ways to maintain the longevity of what we've already got built. Now, what are the other factors that are going to cause problems with that? The climate change that we talked about a little bit earlier. How is concrete and asphalt going to react in a state where the average annual temperature is now 3 degrees higher than it was 50 years ago when we engineered that road? What's going to happen to the infrastructure? Well, anybody who knows anything about asphalt, we refer to it as a flexible pavement. We don't call it a rigid pavement. Why? Because asphalt is never solid. It still hurts when you get hit on the head with a chunk of asphalt, but if you're in a truck parking lot, at a truck stop, or you pull into a scale and they've got a black top apron on the way in, you'll notice ruts 6 to 8 inches deep from the hot wheels and the truck sitting on that, pushing that asphalt away. It flows away. If your asphalt is always in a flowable state because the temperature of the earth is warmed up, you're not going to get far. You're going to be back to that picture from 1918 where you're axle deep in asphalt instead of in mud. So these are important questions, and it takes research, it takes maintenance, it takes new materials, and it takes money, and the current system isn't doing it. And in fact, the American Society of Civil Engineers in 2013 put out their 4-year report card on America's infrastructure. Roads got a D. America as a whole got a D+. If you go on YouTube and you look for the Stephen Colbert Report's take on that report card, he gets real excited because we're up from a D- from 2009. So we're moving in the right direction, but we still got a long ways to go. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you very much, Leighton. That was a fascinating lecture on transportation in Iowa. And I just love listening to people talk about the bridges, and the photographs that you brought also were wonderful, as well as the illustrative map. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Maeve. It was an honor to be invited to give the Weber lecture. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.